of those lives are playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, when the president put pen to paper and assented to the law, it meant the public could do whatever they wanted with LGBT people. The government basically sanctioned homophobia. And if a leader does that, that means the public feels it's okay. And that means that there's been increased vigilance within the public of Uganda to first of all report any known LGBT people to police. We've had quite a number of arrests. We've had a couple of cases where these two men were found, washing Sex and the City, and apparently that's code word for practicing homosexuality. Literally, police comes and knocks on your door, and that for me is a form of witch hunt. Unfortunately, that is what is happening. We've had cases of violence where someone will call you because they know we have a community that looks after each other. Someone will call you and say, I'm in danger, and then you go and you get beaten up. So there's some sort of cliques that are determined to hurt gay people. We've had, of course, cases of public outings. I was outed so many times after the president signed the law, and that increases the risk of violence towards you. I can't use public transport. I can't walk on the streets of Kampala as freely as I did before I was outed, even though I was an activist. I can never go anywhere near a police station. We have had to stop going to work. We work remotely, but we can't go to offices because our organizations are under review. Police is watching us. And as much as we don't have bodies lying around in Kampala because of as a result of this war, I feel like mob justice is not when people are being beaten up, it's when you don't feel safe in your own country. And that for me, it's not worse, but it's kind of the worst form of mob justice. I would rather feel free to walk in a country where leaders are obligated to protect me.
Thank you. So bringing it back to Chicago, Trian, could you speak about what kind of violence we see against the trans and the LGBT community here in Chicago, and how that impacts the ability of LGBT Chicagoans to live sort of public lives?
Well, I know personally that there's issues with me with passing. I think that as a non-binary trans person, that just going on to the train, like to the south side of Chicago, or to actually any part of Chicago for that matter, there's always this fear of potentially being hurt because I don't, because people are unsure of what I look like, and I know that's one thing that I struggle with, and I try to not to make myself as present when I'm walking in different spaces, and I know personally there's issues with specifically Boys Town, which is the queer area of Chicago. I could walk those streets easily and be comfortable, but then I feel uncomfortable, I think, in terms of my race. I think that people would be some people would cross the street or something if I'm walking too fast, or if I'm playing loud music, in my headphones or something, and people are who I don't know, when they cross the street, different things like that. I know that's what I face, and I know that there's also issues of other homeless youth that I've seen, at least specifically around the Belmont station, I think, on the Red Line in Chicago, which is the main area where the Boys Town is. I've seen there's tons of police cars, and there's tons of youth walking those streets and just enjoying themselves. And I know that there's just this fear, at least for me anyway, there's just this fear of police stopping to approach us. And I've heard instances of people not doing anything wrong and just gotten off the train, and there's been like police like messing with them, and I think they have like literally stripped someone at a station just like for proof, I guess, of getting on the train, or there was just some like weird issue. And I don't know. And then I guess like there was like tons of people walking by, and no one like wanted to do anything about it. And so I don't know, I think just like things like that are things that I've noticed and things that I've experienced. But I can't say for everyone, because I know like trans women also receive a lot of issues with like the police and things like that.
Thanks. So I want to get Andre here to jump in on the more national perspective on this question, but we do have a question from the audience, and I think it plays into what you just said, Trian. And the question is, what is the best way to be an active ally, especially for the trans community? And so maybe I just tweak the question to be, from your perspective, what is the best way to be an active ally here in Chicago to support trans human rights?
Well, I think the first thing is to, one, be better educated, I think, on trans issues. Keep an ear out for the different things that are happening like in different communities or different different neighborhoods or different things like that. Would definitely be the first step. And then just practicing inclusivity, knowing to like ask people's like preferred pronouns, and then from that point on just to be more active and getting involved with other organizations that work with trans rights, questioning other organizations, especially other like gay organizations, especially ones that are focused on marriage, to press them to push forward to look to other issues, specifically trans issues, and like bringing more trans people into the room to know like what's going on in different communities.
Thank you. So Andre, did you want to jump in about the question of violence? How are we seeing violence play out against LGBT people in the U.S. more broadly, and sort of what can we really do about that as human rights advocates?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I think that we do see a lot of violence, and I think Clare makes a really brilliant and important point about the different ways in which violence exists in different places, and that some things that are more visible sometimes get a lot of attention, and the things that are sort of deep-seated but also really squash the ability for individuals to like live their lives to their full potential. Like that stuff isn't always as easy to see. And I think one of the ways that we've really thought about how do you deal with violence in the long term. I think obviously we're pushing against laws like the Anti-Homosexuality Act and others, and we want to be supportive of that work. But in doing that, at the end of the day, we really have to shift culture as well. We have to shift the way that people like see and understand LGBTI people. We need to change the way that they understand our families, who we are, how we are, what we do, all of those things that have had a really sweeping impact in countries like the US, in parts of this country, parts of other countries. We need to do a lot more of that. So a lot of the way that we think about our work, even when we're sort of pursuing a particular policy change, we're also thinking about how we're telling the story around that work in a way that reaches people who aren't already on our side, who reaches the people who are in the middle, and also language and ways of framing these issues that make it easy for people who are sympathetic but who don't necessarily know the right way to talk about these issues to be able to take them onto their Facebook wall or talking to their mom or their grandma about these issues that can sometimes be pretty tricky. So I think that's a really important part of the work we have to do to sort of start shifting culture here and other places away from violence. I think in this country there's been a ton of work done on how that actually happens. What are the kind of frames, stories, spokespeople that really move a person who's kind of ambivalent about LGBT rights more into like the pro-equality camp, and that's about personal stories and these other things. I think there's a lot more of that work that needs to be done around the world, and we've been partnering on a couple of projects asking that question in places like India and in South Africa. What's the language and the spokespeople that people really respond to that we can sort of engage and use to help move away from violence and towards a greater empathy and understanding.
Thanks, Andre. So going back to the question of allies, we have a question from the audience directed to Clare, which is there a network of straight allies in Uganda who helps protect LGBT human rights?
Yeah, thank you so much. The beauty of the coalition that we started in 2009 is that it's not just a coalition of LGBT groups. We have HIV and AIDS allies, we have children's rights groups, we have women's rights groups, we have organizations that are working on broader issues than LGBT issues. So that has been quite helpful in terms of mainstreaming the LGBTI rights issue as a human rights issue. Because if an MP or religious leader is saying gay people or LGBT people are after their children, or the agenda for the LGBTI people is pedophilia, if we in instances had children's rights organizations say, these are the statistics. It's actually heterosexuals that have that are killing our children, that are raping our children. The issue is not whether rape is okay for that. Sorry, the issue is not whether heterosexual people should have a higher sentence than homosexual people. Rape is rape, and it should be criminalized the same way. Not saying that homosexuals deserve a larger sentence than heterosexual people. So we've had quite important allies in terms of who speaks on behalf of the community. That worked for a while and continues to work for us.
And so now, Andre, I was wondering, we have a question about what allies here in the U.S., right? So all of us in this room who are going to be going back to our communities, or maybe you're from Chicago, which is great, but for those of you that are going back to your communities, what is the most effective way that allies can approach and engage with the LGBT community to support and further LGBT human rights work?
When you say allies, you mean like people who are caring about LGBT issues but who don't identify
as LGBT.
Oh, sure. Well, about, of those 2 million-ish people who are part of All Out, depending on how you ask the question, which is interesting, about half of those people identify as straight. And so a lot of those people have joined the community as allies. But I think what's interesting is kind of challenging what it is we mean by an ally. Like, what does it mean to be an ally? So for us, people you're not an ally to the All Out community if you're not LGBT. You're in the center of that community if you believe in fairness, equality, that people shouldn't have to sacrifice all those things I talked about earlier. And so I think there's a way that we really want to be thinking about those people being brought into the center, and then I would encourage people who are here, who care about those issues, to also feel that you have a lot of responsibility in this movement. There's a lot of work for you to do to move the people in your lives and get them to think differently, and that's really how we're going to get some of the bigger changes that we see. I think in terms of what you can do, I think the sort of education question is really key to understand what the organizations are doing where you are at home. So a lot of times there are many organizations who are doing incredible work who may or may not be on your radar, and I think a lot of times, too often the instinct is to see a problem, to think that nobody is working on it, and to just jump in there and try to start doing something, when in fact there have been people who have been thinking about it, working on it, talking on it, organizing around it for some period of time. So I think really trying to do the research and help find those folks and find out where you can plug into existing activities is really helpful. And then I think, there are groups, obviously Amnesty, All Out, others, who are trying to help do some of this work to help facilitate kind of what are the moments, the opportunities where people can really jump in and get involved. And I think jumping on those is really helpful.
Thanks, Andre. So we have another question about, and this is for all of our panelists, in your LGBT rights work, how do you deal with sort of heteronormative institutions? The example here is the church. Have you had any success with people of faith who still support LGBT human rights? So I guess we'll start down with Clare and Trian and then Andre.
Unfortunately, religion is one of the biggest factors of intolerance in Uganda, and that institution has been pushing for intolerance and discrimination towards the LGBT community. The anti-homosexuality bill started with religion. It was, unfortunately, right-wing American evangelist extremists who came to Uganda and said, apparently they failed here, and they are transferring their homophobia and their agenda to Uganda and other African countries. So the message was, these people are after your children. Their message was, you need to start to look at this group closer because they are powerful, they have strong links, internationally. This is a community you need to focus on. Unfortunately, that focus wasn't, good focus in terms of protection. It was more like you need to criminalize these people. Otherwise, they are against the traditional marriages. They're going to ensure that we can no longer produce, or they're going to wipe out humanity. Unfortunately, these are the messages that the religious leaders back home feed to their folk. In terms of how we've been able to bring these guys closer to us, we have been very unsuccessful. We've had some religious leaders who will say, okay, I will pray for you, I support you, but I can never come out and publicly speak for your rights because I will lose my folk. Again, and unfortunately, it comes back to money. The number of people that come to your church, that means you have more money in offertory. So we have had no success with religious leaders, apart from one religious leader who stepped out and said, I will speak for the voiceless. That's Reverend Christophe Senyonjo. He's an amazing person. He's the only person that he's the only religious leader that will be comfortable enough to pray for an LGBT person, at a funeral. Other religious leaders want to condemn you, even in your grave. So he's the only religious leader that hosts a Sunday for LGBT people where you can go and not be condemned, because other churches are just terrible. So yeah, we have one, but he's amazing.
Thank you. Trian?
I think that from what I've seen, as far as from other stories that I've heard, as far as churches and religion, I know that of those of the trans community that have the ability to pass, I think that there's not less of an issue, but there's the ability to float under the radar of like having difficulty, I think, in those spaces. But I do know of individuals who are out, I think, and I think that of those people, they have been able to find space, and I also think, and I think that through that they've been able to find a lot of support. But I know that, I personally, I feel very uncomfortable going into those spaces, mostly because I'm not sure of how I'll be perceived. And I also know that, most places that are heteronormative, people try to push for me to pass and say that you'll do better, like just do this and different things like that. But my goal as a trans person isn't, or as a non-binary trans person, is not to do that. So I find that to be difficult, and I haven't found a way to navigate those spaces just yet.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity here. It's right now looks like a challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity. To piggyback on what Claire was saying, I think this is one of the most important things that we can do in the US is to make sure that our religious institutions and our dollars that go into our religious institutions aren't being sent overseas and financing the kind of campaigns that add momentum to the Anti-Homosexuality Act, but also same things happening in Brazil, same things happening in Russia, throughout Eastern Europe, throughout other parts of Africa as well. And I think there's a real role for us, and especially for young people within communities of faith, to ask the question. I think that's really the first step. When I put my $5 or my $10 in this collection plate, where is it going? Where is it going? We have an overseas mission. What does that mean? What are we doing in that mission? Why are we doing it? Who decided? Does the church community get to speak about that? I think there's a lot of work that can be done there, and I think what we often have are religious institutions that are almost unwittingly putting money into the system, supporting values that actually they don't believe in. And we have the opportunity to really sort of shine the light on that and to help people make some better decisions. I think, also to go sort of one step further, I think in terms of religious leaders sort of coming on as allies, I think we've seen a few great places where religious leaders have taken the opportunity of marriage equality to come out in support of that. But what we haven't seen is sort of a sustained commitment from many of those communities to be on the right side of this issue. And I think one of the things, especially for young people, I think churches are very concerned about exactly this question. If you look at all the demographic data, you see that 80% of people under the age of 25 think fundamentally differently about LGBT rights in this country than their predecessors and older people. Churches are thinking, what is the future of our church if we have a policy that says we don't support the LGBT community? Not only we won't marry people here, but we won't ask these questions. We won't open up a debate. We won't allow people who are trans to come here and feel welcome. They're asking themselves that question. They know they have to grapple with that, and I think there's a real role that we can play to sort of help in a positive way really shape that conversation, and we can start it by making sure that we're doing no harm even before we even make those sort of positive stances in favor of equality.